Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Schmidt Ocean Institute and research vessel Falkor. We thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Deborah Smith, and I am joined today by the co-PIs from our current expedition, visiting the Coral Sea. So we'd like to thank you for joining us on YouTube and Facebook. We are going to be joining with our PIs as they discuss where the expedition has been, where we're continuing to work and go to forward, and talk a little bit about what we've been doing with the ship and the multi-beam and our utilization of ROV Sebastian. So I'd like to ask everybody to please send in your comments on YouTube and Facebook. We're going to do a question and answer section towards the end. However, if there's something relevant to the current topic, the principal investigators will try to answer those as they can as we go along. So first of all, I'm going to go ahead and have our group introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Dr. Eric Eakins, Collection Manager of Sessile Marine Invertebrates at the Queensland Museum. So I'm interested in the biological animals that are down there. My specialty interest on this expedition will be carnivorous sponges.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Dr. Robin Beeman. I'm a research fellow at James Cook University based in Cairns, Australia. I'm the chief scientist for this expedition. My role is helping to coordinate everybody and the planning, but my interest is mainly around ocean floor mapping and marine geology.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Rich Fitzpatrick. I'm from Biopixel and James Cook University in Cairns campus, and I've spent a lot of time out in the Coral Sea making documentaries, but I'm also interested in the sharks that are living down in the deep and to see what's happening down there in these amazing videos that are coming in.
Hello everybody, my name is Jody Webster. I'm from the Geocoastal Research Group at the University of Sydney. And like Rob, I'm a marine geologist. I have a special interest in fossil coral reef systems, but also submarine landslides and submarine canyons, and we're getting some really spectacular imagery and data from the flanks of these reefs, which I'm really interested in.
Hi, I'm Dr. Tom Bridge. I'm the Senior Curator of Corals at the Queensland Museum, based at the Museum of Tropical Queensland in Townsville, and also a Research Fellow at the Centre of Excellence for Coral Reef Studies at James Cook University. So, unsurprisingly, my interest is mainly in corals, and so a lot of my research, especially in the Coral Sea, is in much shallower waters than this. But I'm also interested in the corals that live in the deep sea, and so this expedition is an opportunity to explore areas that nobody's ever seen before. So, yeah, it's been really interesting and exciting, and hopefully we can start to see whether some of the patterns in the deep sea are similar to what we're finding for the corals in the shallow waters.
Good morning, everyone. My name's Dr. Brendan Brook. I'm a marine geoscientist at Geoscience Australia in Canberra, Australia. I lead the National Seabed Mapping team here, and my interests in terms of research and also the team's effort focuses on improving the coverage and access to high-resolution seabed data, but also importantly looking into the research related to the distribution of seabed features. So we're talking here about large-scale structures like canyons, reefs, and seamounts. How they form, why they are where they are there particular characteristics that can be used to better identify them in terms of how they influence the distribution of biodiversity on the seabed. So when we're talking about biodiversity from the national mapping perspective, we're talking about things like deep water coral communities and sponge gardens. So these amazing and very poorly known biology that occurs in the deep environments that we're, really just starting to get a handle on what's out there in places like the Coral Sea through the amazing capabilities of Falkor and the Schmidt Ocean Institute. Back to you, Rob.
Yeah, thanks everybody. And I'm going to send it over to Rob to kick us off and tell us a little bit about where we're working and why we're here.
Yeah, thanks, Debs. And if you can bring up that Google Earth overlay, and I'll give people a sense of where we're at. But firstly, I'd just like to remind everybody why this voyage is kind of strange in that there are no scientists. None of the people that are speaking today are actually on board the ship. We're scattered all over Australia. So myself, I'm in Cairns. We've got Mary Eakins in Brisbane. Richard Fitzpatrick's also in Cairns, though I haven't seen him for quite a while because of COVID. Jodie Webster's in Sydney. Brendan's in Canberra. And so this whole voyage is being run by telepresence, and that's why that's really unusual. But if we bring us back into why we're here, we're looking into the deep Coral Sea Marine Park. Now, the Coral Sea Marine Park was declared 2 years ago by the Australian government as part of a network of Commonwealth marine reserves all around Australia. The Coral Sea Marine Park is the largest of those marine reserves. It's nearly 1 million square kilometres, and it abuts directly up against the Great Barrier Reef. You can see Cairns, there's the city of Cairns, this is where I am in, on the Google Earth overlay map, and you can see the Great Barrier Reef running all along the edge there. That Great Barrier Reef runs for around 2,500 kilometres along the edge of Queensland, the state of Queensland. But offshore of that is the vast Coral Sea. Now, the Coral Sea is bounded by Australia on the west, Papua New Guinea to the north, Solomon Islands, and New Caledonia to the east. And it's a tropical area. It's warm and tropical, and there are these very, very large coral reefs. They're sitting on this plateau. It's a very large carbonate plateau, carbonate being limestone because it's tropical. It's called the Queensland Plateau. It's a really big area. It's a big chunk of this Coral Sea Marine Park, and it is virtually unexplored in the deeper areas. If we can just zoom in a little bit closer there, Debs, we'll just focus in on the plateau. The plateau itself is what's called a marginal plateau. It's on this edge of the Australian margin. It's very large in size. It's around 280,000 square kilometres. It's quite old. We know it's old from studies that were done in the 1980s. It goes back millions of years, back to when Australia actually started breaking up from that large landmass called Gondwana. But over time, what we have is around 30 really large coral atolls. Coral atolls, just like normal coral atolls in the deep oceanic waters, have lived and grown on this Queensland plateau. Debs, can you just take your cursor and do a bit of a circle around the plateau so people can see where we're talking about? That's it. Yeah, thank you. And so I've mentioned these 30 large atolls. They really are large. Can you go down to the south, the Diamond Islets and Lehigh Reef? Down at the very bottom on the southern side of the Queensland Plateau, these two atolls are some in the top 20 largest atolls in the world. They're nearly 100 kilometres long. So these are very, very large coral atolls. There's shallow coral growing around the edges. Those reefs are actually quite well studied by scuba divers and the like. But it's actually the deeper areas which are the really, really hard places to get to, both to map with sonar systems or even put cameras down. And of that, we really, before the research vessel Falkor arrived, we really had no idea of what's down there. So what I'd like to do today is just take you on a bit of a tour of what we've discovered so far. the Falkor's been out there for about 2 weeks now, and this sort of yellowy pinky area is what has been mapped, and this is very detailed map. So we're going to do a bit of a tour, starting in the north, up at around Osprey Reef. Thanks, Deb. And if you can kind of zoom in there, give people a sense this coloration. If you just stop there for a moment. All right, just to give you a bit of an understanding of what we've done here. The Falkor has been mapping around the edges of these reefs. Now, the actual shallow bits are coloured red to blue. That's like the atoll in the middle. Now, that was done by the Navy, the Royal Australian Navy, using LiDAR. And LiDAR can only map down to around 40, 50 metres. So we actually have quite good maps for the shallow reefs themselves. So that's what we had before the Falkor arrived. But since the Falkor has started this expedition, we've now been mapping around the edges of Osprey Reef and these two very long linear reefs to the southeast. They're called Shark and Vima. So, Debs, would you be able to bring up the Fledermaus view of this area? And we'll have a look at it in a 3D perspective, and we'll start talking about what we've discovered. Yeah, that's great, Debs. Okay, so what we've now got is a full three-dimensional vision of what the seafloor looks like. Now, just to remind you, that sort of white area that Debs has now coloured is where we'd mapped previously. So we understood kind of the shallow area, but all around the edges was a complete mystery. We knew the general depths because of old mapping that had been done, way back, many decades ago. But none of this detail, we had no idea. And so perhaps you could just zoom in a bit closer there, Debs, and we'll start to bring in the other PIs and sort of get their perspective. Osprey Reef was the first reef that we actually mapped around the edges. And so for me, it was quite a revelation. Jody, do you want to talk about what we're seeing here in that view?
Yeah, Rob. What's really striking from a, marine geology perspective is the very, very different seafloor geometry on the western side versus the eastern side. We can see there's much more well-developed canyon systems on this view that we're seeing now, as opposed to the other side, which is much smoother. We're also able to see quite clearly these bite-sized chunks that are observed in the modern reef, but we can actually see the deeper expression of those features, and we can now confirm that these are essentially very large and probably quite old submarine landslide features, which have produced this classic sort of shape. And that, of course, has had a significant impact on the structure and nature of the seafloor, which has also conditioned the biology that we're seeing in the ROVs.
Yeah, thanks, Jody. Debs, we might just go straight into the dive. So the Falkor had actually mapped around the full extent of Osprey Reef, and then we decided our very first Sebastian ROV dive would be on the southwest corner of that, and that was 354. So let's just have a look at some of the vision going down, and we might be able to talk through what we saw as we're coming up. We have to remember this is quite deep depths. This first dive was down at 1,600 metres, so it was over a kilometre, 1.6 kilometres down in the ocean. Richard, good one for you. Maybe you could tell us or give us an idea of what we're looking at.
Okay, this is probably one of the deep water dogfish sharks. We don't exactly know what species it is yet because we have to analyse the video as it comes in closer. But yeah, there's There are deep water sharks out there. We know from a previous expedition where we've put bait traps down out there, we've actually had one bait trap severely mauled, so we know there's something big down there. And interestingly, when we've had tuna baits inside cages, we've actually even had cookie cutter shark marks on the tuna carcasses when we've brought them up. Unfortunately, not collecting the cookie cutters. So there are some deep water shark species around, but we're just hoping we see more on the Sebastian dives. And we can talk about the shallow water stuff a bit later on. So yeah, it's some cool stuff, but I'll throw it back to some of the coral boys now.
Merrick, do you want to talk about this cold water ecosystem we're seeing? So we're down a kilometre deep, like the temperatures, and like everything's quite different to what you find in the shallows.
Yeah, well, down here we've got a whole lot of box corals, and I can see some gold corals coming up here. These guys are all filter feeders, and obviously they can't photosynthesize at that depth, so they've got to collect all the nutrients and whatever washes past. So these guys all like to hang out where there's quite a bit of current, and they have to be away from the snow so they don't get smothered by all the detritus drifting down on them. So what you tend to find is sometimes on an ROV dive, you'll hit these big spaces of nothing that what to me looks like snow, and you can describe that better in geological terms. And then you suddenly hit these great spots like we are now, where there's an outcropping and it's clear of enough snow that all the marine animals can all live in there, and you suddenly get this explosion of biodiversity. So that's what's really cool, and that's when I get excited. So I'm of course, yeah, this is a beautiful glass sponge, the hyaluronas. Beautiful. And you can see in this case, they produce a big stalk to get them above all that detritus layer, so they can actually do proper filter feeding up there. And so what I'm really looking for are these carnivorous sponges, and most of them are really tiny, from 2 millimetres up to a maximum of 20 centimetres in the water. And these guys have decided to change their lifestyle from a filter feeder to one where they capture animals by the shape of this keel. And so they've gone to a carnivorous sort of lifestyle, which is very interesting. It wasn't even discovered till the 90s. But people had collected these from back in the 1800s, but they never realised they were carnivorous. So I'm hoping to find some of these specimens. And what we can do with this ROV, we can get fantastic footage because no one's seen them underwater, what they look like.
Thanks, Merrick. Debs, I think how about we talk about the next dive, which is 355 up at North Horn, at the very northern end. And, one of the striking things there was the Nautilus. Now, Richard, again, you've had a bit of experience with this. Maybe you could talk about chambered Nautilus a bit.
Yeah, so I do know Dr. Andy Dunstan's watching at the moment, who has done all the work on these animals. I was lucky enough to work with Andy almost 20 years ago when he started his projects out at Osprey Reef back in the undersea explorer days, where we used to put cages down a couple hundred metres with baits in them, and then bring these Nautilus up to the surface. So the Nautilus is probably the most ancient form living today of the cephalopods. So that includes, like squid and cuttlefish and octopus. And a lot of people are probably familiar with the shell because, you see them around the place, which has also been the undoing of Nautilus in many places around the world. But Andy's work has shown that at Osprey Reef, there's quite a healthy population. And so what he would do is, once the Nautilus were brought to the surface, luckily they don't go through pressure problems. They'd be kept in cold water, simulating, the lower temperatures that they had come from. And then he would actually number the Nautiluses, and it was a mark recapture process out there, and that's how he was able to determine the population. He also did some acoustic tracking of these animals to show how they move up and down in the water column from day to night as well. But they're a fascinating animal, and the best part of the project was we'd release them at night time to prevent predation. So you'd swim them down to 30 or 40 metres at night and just release these Nautilus into the water and get to have a bit of a swim with them and watch how they jet propulse around like all the cephalopods do. And it was just amazing. But yeah, and I was lucky to be there on lots of different expeditions where we would recapture these Nautilus over many, many years. And I see on a few of the other expeditions, I think they saw 18 in total on that North Horn dive. But some of the other reefs, they've seen dead Nautilus shells on the bottom. So we know, and Andy's work show that they are in the Coral Sea. But yeah, Osprey's a fantastic place if tourists want to go out and see a live Nautilus.
Yeah, thanks very much, Richard. Debs, what we might do is just hold the video there, and back to that 3D perspective, and we'll just take people on the tour from Osprey Reef down towards the Holmes Reefs. Now, these are around about 200 kilometres due east of Cairns. That's right. If you can sort of, that's it. Thank you with the cursor. So we went around Bougainville Reef. Again, very interesting place. We'll probably go back and revisit this at some point. But thank you. And then we headed down to Cairns Seamount, a small dot in the ocean, which is now really well mapped. And then we headed to what's called the Holmes Reefs. There's a west and an east Holmes Reefs. Thanks, Deb. If you can just sort of centre that. They're lying directly beside each other. Now, they're a bit in scale, they're about 20 kilometres across, at their broadest limit. And they just sit there. They're kind of odd the way they do. But again, we see this interesting morphology or shape of the seafloor. Brendan, maybe you want to just talk about what you see in this picture of Holmes Reefs.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, Rob. And, it does have a lot of similarities with what we saw up at Osprey, with that windward side, or the side that's exposed to the west and so to the east and to the southeast, has quite a sharp, steep margin. And then on the leeward side, or to the west, there's a lot of obviously erosion going on, or indeed a lot of sediment probably streaming off the reef structure itself and being transported to the west, eventually moving down into the deeper basin areas. But along with that, those bottom currents that are causing those erosional features clearly, flowing to the west. So we're getting some, from these big high resolution images, we're getting some, really important insights into, what are the major driving processes that are leading to, the large scale structures we're looking at, but also we're getting some, much finer scale detail as well in terms of, where ultimately is the sediment that's being produced on those reefs flowing to. Jody might have some interesting comments on this one as well.
Yeah, just to follow on, Brendan. There's some spectacular structures that we can see. Debs, if you could just zoom in a little bit closer on some of those canyons, and I think we can see some really nice evidence of exactly what Brendan has been talking about. In some of these canyons, there are actually quite well-developed sand waves, quite large structures in the axis of these channels or conduits. And they're actually giving us a really good indication of obviously the direction of transport within these pathways and the sediment that is moving from the top of the reef across the slope and into the deep basin. So really quite spectacular.
Yeah, thanks, Jody and Brendan. Just so people understand the depth scale here, that yellow is around 1,000 metres deep. So it's 1 kilometre deep at the bottom of the flanks of these reefs. And with that in mind, we decided to run up the edge of this particular reef. This is West Holmes Reef. We chose this site because it seemed to have what looked like an undersea landslide. This is like looked like a chunk of the edge had given way, and it left this sort of steep area. You can see almost like a gully on the side. Well, everything just left of that is actually has slid away into the deeper plateau surface at about 1 kilometre down. So we ran ROV. It was 357 up here. And Debs, perhaps we can go to that video now, 357, and just we can talk about what we saw there.
Yeah, Rob, that's the video that's playing in the picture-in-picture. So it's been playing while you guys have been talking about this area. So
Yeah, I might just jump in there, Debs. Yeah, just to say a little bit about the video. When we were watching this, I got incredibly excited because we're able to see in the video now this quite obvious layering of different rock types, larger grains, finer grains, and in fact, with the Sebastian's really excellent camera, and you can actually see it at the base of that section. I think it may actually zoom in there. You could actually see the coarse coral debris which has been shed from the top of the platform, and then over hundreds of thousands of years, this has been deposited in these sort of sub-horizontal layers. Then we may have quiet or quiescent periods where we get finer deposition. And then, of course, at some point, there's been this spectacular submarine landslide, which has exposed all of these deposits. And then on the earlier part of the video, we could actually see these much, much larger blocks which were coherent pieces of the reef that have fallen off and down the slope and then been deposited. So really, it's like you see this in textbooks, but to see it on the seafloor is really quite spectacular. And of course, from the deep sea biology perspective, there's all sorts of interesting biota attached to these things, which I'm sure some of the other guys can talk about.
Yeah, thanks, Jody. I might throw to Tom here. Mate, Tom, we've mentioned the word habitat a few times, but Jody's talking about the contrast between sand and rock, and how does that influence the marine life that we see on the seafloor between those different substrate?
Yeah, thanks, Rod. Obviously the different habitats in any ecosystem have a really big influence on the type of biota that we see. In terms of in the marine environment, there's a lot of types of, especially the habitat forming, I guess, sessile benthos, which is what I'm interested in, which is more or less things like corals and sponges and these sort of groups of marine invertebrates that form three-dimensional habitat structure in the ocean. So most of these live generally on these hard substrates. So the sandy areas tend to be much lower slope, and there's still completely other different types of ecological communities there. So it might be things like worms or other things that are happy to live on the sand, but we really start to see a lot more of these things like corals and black corals and gorgonians, things like that on these hard substrates. So that's for a few reasons. They need to be able to settle on this hard substrate, and they also, especially when they're small, if too much sediment accumulates, then they get buried and they can't grow. So it's really important that you have these sort of bare substrates for these guys to grow on. So that's why these areas that we're really looking for in the RO, ones that are very much have these steps or these really obvious features, whether it's things like overhangs, especially as we get into the shallower areas, you really start to see these overhangs. We've seen some quite spectacular ones on some of these reefs that where the sediment doesn't accumulate, and that really allows really dense growth of some of these groups, especially octocorals and things like that. So that's really an important driver of these, what we see in the different parts of the dives. And then also light is obviously a critical one as well. So obviously with my interest in corals, most of that is tends to be in the shallow. I tend to think of corals as living in really shallow water, but they can live quite deep, particularly in places like the Coral Sea that has very clear water, because it's a long way from any landmass or any rivers or anything like that. And so we can see corals down to over 100 metres depth. This is your typical shallow water corals that rely on sunlight. But we really see down to about 200 metres, we see sorts of biodiversity on these reefs that's dominated by phototrophs, so things that derive energy from light. So whether that's hard corals, but also other things as well, so algae and so forth. We then have a zone down to about 400 metres where there is some light, but not enough to support photosynthesis. So we start to see a different suite of fauna, and then once we get below about 400, 500 metres, we really get into this area that's in perpetual darkness. So that really has a strong influence on the sort of communities that we see. And also, obviously, temperature. You know, we're in the tropics, and so we think, oh, it's really warm, and of course, up at the surface, it often is. It's 29, 30 degrees. But as we go down, even at sort of 150 metres, it will often be down to maybe below 20. And then by the time we're getting down into this deeper water, we're really seeing temperatures that would be, I guess, more characteristic of much higher latitudes. So that's places like Antarctica or Southern Australia. We're getting into temperatures of, single figures, 4, 5, 6 degrees. So all of these things really have a strong influence on the types of biodiversity that we see.
Yeah, thanks very much, Tom. After we left Holmes, we ended up down in what's called the Flinders Reefs. And this is in the view now. You can see this 3D perspective. There's this North Flinders, this very big atoll, well mapped in the shallow area, but around the edges, we had no idea. And then this other atoll, smaller, around about 10 kilometres across. We call this South Flinders Reef. And again, we're seeing this really interesting, almost these big undersea landslides where basically the flank has collapsed and have left these sort of exposed scarp areas, like like a typical landslide that you might find on land. But here it's over 1 kilometre underwater, and we did our next dive up the side of this. Jody, maybe you could just say quickly about this scarp face, about why we chose here and what we were hoping to see.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. So this was another point of interest. Again, you can see that really obvious bite-size landslide. Debs, can you draw the cursor across there? So it's like, how far is that? It's about 5, 6 kilometres.
Yeah, roughly about 4.5.
Yeah, 4.5 kilometres, and then the scarp on the left there is, I think, over 50 to 100 metres high. So, a really large part of the seafloor has been mobilised in probably quite a catastrophic event. And of course, this has shaped the modern reef that has subsequently grown around that. But we picked this spot because it would have a large diversity of different substrate types and slopes, and importantly, different types of habitats for different biota, which the biology team is really interested in understanding.
Thanks, Jody. Yeah, so we're now down around about a kilometre deep underwater. And I might put it to you there, Merrick. Did we see cold water sponges in this area?
Yeah, we can get some deep sea sponges down there. A lot of them are glass sponges. We having trouble. A lot of glass sponges down there, and down the bottom of the ocean here, there's 150 times more silicon than there is at the surface. So you get this real transition between the super shallow water stuff, as in 30 metres where you scuba dive, where you have your normal sponges with a little bit of silicon to make these spicules, but down the bottom we'll have these ones which are pure glass, and they're fantastic to watch it. And along the way we'll have all these other ones called rock sponges, which are also made of glass, and they're big interwoven spicules together. So together let's get this fantastic transition, and we can always get lots of sponges down there. Sponges are great. They've been around for over 500 million years, and they're found in every single ecosystem where there's water, fresh water. So plenty to do there. Problem with sponges is you spend what you can collect in one dive down there. It might take you a year to work out what they all are. But I love that part of it.
Yeah, thanks, Merrick.
Hey, Rob, can
I might put it to you there, Tom. We're getting to that mesophotic zone. Go
Sorry.
ahead, Debs.
Yeah, sorry. I just want to jump in here, guys. We just have about maybe 10 minutes left of our call, and so while we're seeing some of this beautiful imagery and discussing some of that, I just want to reach out to our viewers at home and go ahead and send in your questions now. So if you want to catch our principal investigators while they're here online with you, go ahead and send those questions in, and we'll try to get some of those answered before we need to leave for the day. And just to remind everybody, we are diving tomorrow, so please join us back tomorrow for ROV Dive 359. Sorry, go ahead and answer your question.
Sorry, thanks very much for that, Ted. So this was the mesophotic zone of Flinders Reef. So this is an area that's been of particular interest to me. I did my PhD. There's a coral, very exciting. That's a Nautilus, which is a genus that really dominates this lower mesophotic zone. We're just starting to really work out that most of these species are undescribed. So hopefully there'll be a number of new mesophotic Leptocerus described. We used to think it was just one or two widespread species, but it seems that most of the species down here are unique to this area and or to these depths, but also geographically. So this has been something that's been quite interesting as well. We previously thought that the widespread species originally described from the deep reefs in Hawaii, where it's fairly common, but it now looks like many of these species have much smaller geographic ranges. So that's been really exciting. And with reference to the Coral Sea specifically, Rob was saying at the start that it sort of adjoins the Great Barrier Reef, but at least in the shallows, we're finding that the fauna in the Coral Sea is quite distinct from the Great Barrier Reef, and it's actually in many ways more similar to a lot of the Pacific Islands, so places like Tonga and the Cook Islands, than it is to the Great Barrier Reef. So it'll be really interesting to see if that continues to be the case for the deep. But this particular area, we're really seeing there was a lot of current, and that's really important for what you can see here, these big octocorals, and also the algae provides a lot of nutrients and the ability for these filter feeders to feed. So it's been these strong currents really led to a real profusion of life on these deep lakes of Flinders Reef. So this had never been seen before. We've seen similar sorts of communities in Osprey and a few other places, but it was really exciting to see this out at Flinders Reef.
Thanks, Debs. Sorry, Tom. Debs, would you mind bringing back the 3D view? We'll take viewers on the last stretch of mapping that the Falkor has done over the past week, and this is up to what's called Diane Bank and Flinders Islets. Willis Islets. These two large banks sit together, and it's the focus of the dive tomorrow morning. Yeah, thanks very much. So the ship ended up over on the eastern side of the Queensland plateau, and unfortunately bad weather meant we couldn't do any ROV dives then, but we were able to do quite a lot of mapping. So thanks, Debs, to these smaller reefs, and then we jumped over, and this is Willis Islets on the right-hand side, Diane Bank in the middle, of these two large atolls, and there are these kind of small dots to the left. These are the Moor reefs. There's 3 of them. And we've managed to map all the way around the outsides of these, in the flanks and the plateau surface, which is around about 600 metres depth at the base. Maybe you'll just throw this to Brendan. Perhaps, Debs, if you can zoom in on Willis Islets and just so we can see all of these blocks that are around the edges. And Brendan, maybe you could talk a bit about this very, very lumpy seafloor that we're seeing here.
Yeah, it's fascinating shape that we can see on the seabed. So, yeah, I mean, it must be, quite unique habitat down there, given, there's lots of steep bits. There's probably lots of areas that aren't getting smothered in sediment. So, there's this quite stark physical diversity in the shape and structure of the seabed quite likely relates to, possibly high levels of endemism or unique biological communities that occur there. It also looks like a lot of blocks eroding off the edge of the platform. Maybe Jody wants to illuminate us a little bit on the sorts of processes that these features are reflecting.
Thanks, Brendan. Yeah, it's very interesting and quite different to what we saw on the reefs further to the north. Debs, if you could zoom in and go a little bit to the left. Zoom in right about there and kind of angle up so we can see it a little bit plainer. There you can almost play connect the dots, where you can connect those slabs to those essentially those bites out of the reef. And so this is a different style of flank collapse, where you've had almost the blocks have fallen off, but they haven't gone very far compared with what we saw further to the north, which were these catastrophic failures where the entire flank had collapsed and been excavated and gone kilometres. Here you're getting bits of the forereef and the reef just sort of sloughing off and then falling not very far and then coming to rest. So it's quite a different sort of process here. We've seen this style of collapse in some parts of the Great Barrier Reef, in the shallow areas, in some places where we've worked off Townsville, in fact, and some shallow shelf and upper slope flank collapse structures. So it'd be really interesting indeed.
Yeah, thanks, Jody. And those colours, that yellow, is around about probably 800 metres deep. So just to give you a sense of scale, it's almost a kilometre deep there. But I've got a question for you, Jody. We've talked a fair bit about landslides, and we're seeing blocks and these big sheet slides. Could any of those have formed tsunamis in a long geological past? Is that possible?
Yes, indeed. So some of these larger structures, we've done some work, obviously, in the Great Barrier Reef, and we've imaged a number of these, as large, in fact, some larger submarine landslides. And the working with colleagues, the modelling that we've done, which basically tries to figure out how big, how much and how far and how fast these blocks have moved, and thus displaced water, and could they have produced tsunamis? And then the second part of the question is, could they have potentially impacted the coast at the time? And the answer is yes. There's quite a spectacular slide off Cairns called the Gloria slide, which Rob and I have worked on, which is a huge structure, so 20, 30 kilometres across, which has failed down to about 1,000 metres. And at the time, several 100,000 years ago, that would have produced a sizable tsunami at the coast.
Great, thanks, Jody. Now, I guess that wraps up what we've done so far and some of the results we've seen in the really spectacular Sebastian imagery. Debs, maybe we just talk about what we've got planned ahead. Have you got anything for the more reefs, just to show what we're diving on tomorrow? And then I can talk some more broadly about what we have planned for the last remaining weeks that the research vessel Falkor is working in this area. So these are these little dots. Actually, just stop there for a moment. Can you zoom out a little bit, please, Debs? Just zoom out so we got, stop there. Okay, can you put your cursor over the new seamount you've just discovered?
Well, I don't...
That one, yeah. Okay, we didn't know that existed before. So it would be an old drowned reef. The top of it, I think, is in around 300 metres. the bottom is around 900 meters. So it's about 600 meters high, and we didn't even know it existed. So we have to come up with a name, with thinking Deb's Seamount or something like that. But if you can take us to tomorrow's dive, that's the Moor Reef directly north of it, or directly up. That's it, thank you. If you can just zoom in, we'll show where we're going to put the ROV dive in tomorrow morning.
Rob, if I could jump in here real quick, there are a couple questions on Facebook and YouTube, so I just want to reach out and maybe you can describe them while we're talking about tomorrow's dive. But somebody asked, why are the walls so steep? And has this place ever been populated? And then there was a question about the large grouper that we saw, if anybody could confirm it. So maybe Julia will reach out to you separate and answer that question. But can you guys just talk to why things are so steep, why everything is... and maybe this is a perfect example. So tomorrow's dive is along this ridge here.
Yeah, thanks, Deb. Okay, so one thing to remember, these reefs have not grown up from these deep depths up to the surface. They were always near the ocean surface. It's just that the actual plateau itself has subsided over time, over millions of years, in fact. There were 3 big subsidence events. The most recent was around about 3 million years ago. And every time that plateau surface drops, as long as that, whatever the reef, as long as that reef was able to stay within that photic zone growing, then it can maintain its growth and keep up with where the sea level is relative to the depth of water that it's in. And so hence we have these drowned reefs that have given up, were not able to keep up with any change in sea level. They got below that photic zone and they became drowned. These ones have managed to keep up with any subsidence. But the important thing is, I think of them like giant carbonate factories. They're constantly growing and eroding. The coral sediment that is created in those shallow areas falls over the side, and the ROV imagery confirms that. We're seeing lots of sand, and over time you get this base, like the flank comes out steep, and I guess the gradient varies depending on whether there's erosion or canyons or some of these undersea landslides. So that's why in places they're very steep, and in others they're quite gentle. But we've chosen Moor Reefs here for a dive tomorrow because it's of great interest to Parks Australia, who manage this area. And this particular reef has one of the highest biodiversity of shallow water coral and reef fish anywhere in the Coral Sea. So we're curious as to what is in the depths. Remember, we really have no idea what's in the depths. So if we have a long vertical transect with the ROV Sebastian tomorrow, we can kind of join up 2 ends, the shallow end and the deep end, and find out what's living in the middle.
Great. So,
Debs,
sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, if you could just bring up Google Earth, and we do a sort of a wrap up where the ship intends to go over the next few weeks, and then we'll take another question. Okay, thanks. So, as mentioned, we're going to be diving out here on the Moor Reefs. From probably a Saturday afternoon, we'll head to the southeast. We'll be in an area called the Magdalen Cays, Coringa Islets, another one of these very, very large banks. That's probably around about 80 kilometres across. And there's a scattering of smaller reefs around the edge. They have no names, so we may think about what we might name these. From there, we certainly hope to do some ROV dives. We head a little bit further to the southeast. We've got Diamond Islets, Tragos Reefs, and Lehau Reef yet to survey. And there's a scattering of smaller reefs to the west of that. So between now and when the voyage concludes, which is on the 15th of June, there's still a lot of mapping to be done. We hope to do a lot more ROV dives, lots more to discover, and every day is another surprise. So we hope you can enjoy the journey as well as we are. We're like you, we're speaking and watching from home, and seeing the magnificent work that the research vessel Falkor is doing out in the Coral Sea Marine Park. Back to you, Debs.
Yeah, thanks everybody for joining us. Thank you to all of our PIs for taking their time and connecting with the ship and sharing a little bit about this expedition with you at home. So I want to thank everybody at home for joining us on YouTube and Facebook. Reminder, tomorrow's dive, 359, we'll be diving on Moore Reef. The vehicle should go in the water about 8 a.m. Eastern Australia time and be on the bottom about 9 a.m. So please join us, and there's a possibility and probably highly likely we'll also dive Saturday morning, potentially down on Willis Islet. So thank you for joining us. This is Schmidt Ocean Institute, Research Vessel Falkor, and I'm Deborah Smith, the Marine Technician on board, and thank you to our PIs. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, Deb.